Historians, what is the biggest screw you moment in history? The Battle of Alesia. Julius Caesar's attacking some Gauls in modern-day France, and they go hide in a castle on top of a hill. Caesar's army isn't big enough to take them all at once, and the Gauls have reinforcements coming, so a siege is impossible. So Caesar builds a bigger castle around the one he's attacking. He literally just built 2 walls back to back in a ring around the castle. The first Gaul army was already too small to defeat Caesar, and his fortifications only gave him a greater advantage. The reinforcements were also unable to defeat Caesar's army now that he was behind several layers of spike pits and both earthen and wooden walls. Plus, the Gauls inside had no way to communicate with the reinforcements outside, so they couldn't coordinate attacks. Both Gallic armies were defeated as they attacked Caesar's newly built fortifications, and Caesar emerged victorious. It's probably my favorite battle of all time. I can already tell I'm going to say some things wrong in this video. I'll do my best to look up what I'm not confident about, but I will be confidently incorrect about some other things, I'm sure. Story 2. The construction and use of the Warwolf. Supposedly the largest trebuchet ever built. When it was disassembled, it would fill up 30 wagons. So anyway, King Edward I built this to siege a Scottish castle. But before it was even built, the Scottish people tried to surrender, to which Edward responded with a prompt no. In actuality, he responded with, "You do not deserve any grace, but must surrender to my will." In other words, I built this trebuchet over 40 days and I'm most definitely going to use it, and proceeded to use the trebuchet anyway. Story 3. Ferruccio Lamborghini was a rich man owning his company that built tractors. He talked to Ferrari about the imperfections of his car and how to improve them, and they basically laughed at a young tractor mechanic trying to tell them about sports cars. So he decided to start making luxury sport cars to compete with Ferrari, and thus, the rivalry was born. So I'd say the middle finger of this guy to Ferrari was pretty noticeable. Story 4. In the 1940s in the small town of Vulcan, West Virginia, the town asked for state funding to replace a bridge into town. The state legislature refused to grant Vulcan the funding they needed. Instead, the town appealed to the Soviet Union for aid. After hearing about the request, the state legislature immediately granted over $1 million for the town to build a new bridge. If a small town in West Virginia asking for Soviet funding in the middle of the Cold War isn't a big middle finger to the state government, I don't know what is. Story 5. My personal favorite. The beginning of the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England, 1066. England's been invaded by a Norwegian army led by Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, as well as Tostig Godwinson, exiled English earl and estranged brother to the English king. They've already fought one battle. They've captured York. Things are looking good for them. They're chillin', enjoying their success, waiting at the Stamford Bridge for the hostages they demanded. It's a hot day. They're not expecting any trouble. But wait, an English army shows up. That's practically impossible. The Battle of Fulford Gate had only taken place 5 days ago, and the Norwegians had completely routed the forces of the Northern Earls. The rest of the English army was known to be in the south, awaiting a Norman invasion. Turns out the English had ridden all the way up north in 4 days. The Norwegians were understandably a bit unhappy. They form into a circle. They don't have their armor with them, it's at the ships. It's too hot to be hanging around in mail. They've got helmets and shields and weaponry, and that's it. The English send a rider to negotiate. He tells Tostig that his brother, the king, is willing to offer him his earldom back and part of the rule of England if he gives up now. Tostig asks what his buddy Harald Hardrada gets for his trouble, and he was told 6 feet of English ground, or as much more as he needs, being taller than the other men. Tostig says they're done here. The rider rides away. Harald Hardrada asks who that dude was, because if it had been him talking, he'd have just ended the bastard there. Tostig says, "Oh, that's my brother. That's Harold Godwinson, the king." Harold Godwinson rode up to an enemy army personally and told the King of Norway, known to be a great warrior and general, that all he'd get from this invasion was a grave. Battle commences and Norwegians lose. Tostig and Harold Hardrada both die. Huge bloody mess. English army is crippled. And then 3 days later, the Normans land in the south. Harold is screwed. He still marches his army back, gathers as much force as he can, and engages 3 weeks later. He lost his life at Hastings. Normans conquer England. Basically a very personal screw you moment that snowballed quite intensely. Story 6. This requires some background. The Spartans were famously blunt. They were trained to get to the point when speaking, instead of using artsy and beautiful language that would have been common at the time. To do this, they were bit on the thumb if they became long-winded. Now to the meat. Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, sent the Spartans a letter saying, "Would you like me to enter your land as friend or foe?" The Spartans responded with one word: neither. Philip was irate. He then sent another long-winded message. "If once I enter into your territories, I will destroy ye all, never to rise again." The Spartans then sent back one word again, if. It was like putting your head in a lion's mouth, and I love it. Story 7. Genghis Khan to Shah Allah ad-Din. After the Khwarezmids plundered one of Genghis Khan's caravans, ended his people, and took his crap, he thought he was going to take the diplomatic approach and send 2 envoys and an interpreter. Shah Allah ad-Din decided to be an idiot about it. He shaved the heads of the envoys to shame them and sent them back with the head of the interpreter. Mr. Khan was kinda upset, so he marched 200,000 of his boys and annihilated their town with only a quarter of that number even able to fight back. He was so mad at the Shah that he had the rivers keeping the surrounding villages alive fully diverted. So he would literally wipe Ala ad-Din's birthplace off the map and make it so that it was like he never existed. No one would settle there or live there ever again. No one would be there to remember his enemy who had disrespected him. Not even the dogs or cats would be spared, said Genghis Khan. Completely unrelated to this story, I have never, ever in my life heard, and never will again, hear anyone refer to Genghis Khan as Mr. Khan. That just sounds like a high school English teacher. Doesn't really capture the fearsomeness of him, you know? Story 8. French surrender in World War II. Hitler dictates that the French capitulation take place at Cowpens, a forest north of Paris. This is the same spot where 22 years earlier the Germans had signed the armistice ending World War I. Hitler intends to disgrace the French and avenge the German defeat. To further deepen the humiliation, he orders that the signing ceremony take place in the same railroad car that hosted the earlier surrender. The armistice is signed on June 22nd. Under its terms, 2/3 of France is to be occupied by the Germans. The French army is to be disbanded. In addition, France must bear the cost of the German invasion. Story 10. This is the opposite of what you're asking for because it could have been a big screw you, but it went another way. Abraham Lincoln, while still a largely unknown frontier lawyer, was asked to assist in a law case by some bigwigs out in the East because the trial was going to be held in Springfield and they wanted a local lawyer on the team. Well, the location of the trial got moved. The bigwig lawyers were pretty rude to him when he showed up and didn't use any of his arguments and didn't allow him to participate. They did eventually send him a check for payment, but Abe sent it back. They did send it back, though, writing enough to get Abe to deposit the check. When Abe became president, he eventually asked the head lawyer of the bigwigs in this case, Edwin Stanton, to be his Secretary of War. Edwin Stanton grew to truly love Abraham Lincoln and was a very effective Secretary of War. Abe could have remembered the snub from earlier in his career and refused to have anything to do with Stanton, but Abe was never truly offended and saw Stanton as a good person to have in his cabinet. Lincoln was good at not letting grudges rule him. If I recall correctly in the book How to Win Friends and Influence People, a story is relayed where Abe ordered General Meade to chase down the army of Northern Virginia and finished them off after the Battle of Gettysburg. Meade dawdled for 3 days, which let the Confederate army escape. Lincoln was super upset and wrote a letter excoriating Meade for not finishing what was started and noted the war could have ended there, but now it will continue, and how many more will die. Lincoln never sent the letter. He realized he wasn't there. The Union Army had just fought a 3-day battle and were exhausted. It wasn't Lincoln's place to second-guess his commanders who were there. Can you imagine any of our presidents in the last 50 years having such restraint? I can't. Maybe Carter could have done that. Story 11. In the late 1980s, Nintendo and Sony developed a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. Nintendo then pulled out of the partnership and opted to work with Philips instead and released the CDI. This move was highly frowned upon because Nintendo had decided to ditch a fellow Japanese company over a foreign one, so Sony picked up the pieces of the project and tried to partner with Sega. The board of directors turned the idea down, saying, "That's a stupid idea. Sony doesn't know how to make hardware. They don't know how to make software either. Why would we want to do this?" At the end, Sony released a game system by the name of PlayStation in 1994 to compete with the Nintendo 64 and outsold their former partners nearly 3-1. Plus, it marked the first time that Nintendo wasn't top dog since they released the NES. Story 12. I will always think of a story of Andrew Jackson that a history professor told me. Jackson married a woman that was divorced, which was bad already, but she wasn't actually divorced from her last husband. Whenever Jackson heard of people talking badly on him or his wife, he would challenge them to a duel. Yeah, 10 paces and shoot kind of duel. One day he heard of a man that was basically a pro at shooting, and that man was talking mad crap. So Jackson challenged him to a duel because he'll duel anyone. Once the duel started, they went to shoot. Jackson just dropped his gun because he knew he didn't have the skill of his opponent. The other man shot and missed. So Andrew Jackson picked up his gun, walked up to his opponent, and shot him in the forehead. The only thing I learned from that class. I mean, hey, that's a man who loves his wife, or really likes dueling. Maybe both. And apparently some higher powers smiled on him there too. He was ready to die. Story 13. The Battle of Cowpens during the Revolutionary War. A U.S. commander was given a large number of militiamen who in battle were known to fall back before being given orders. The British, knowing that colonial regulars would stand ground and the militia wouldn't, would often press attacks to bring their numbers and weapons to great effect. And so this U.S. commander decided to make a stand at a place where his army couldn't retreat, at a place called Cowpens. The specific position was basically a small peninsula that was surrounded by a big river that you couldn't reasonably cross if, say, you were trying to evade gunfire. Once situated, the commander set his troops up in 3 lines. The militiamen up front where they would fire first, the more experienced guys in the second wave firing second, and the hardened veterans in the third rank. When the British came, they tried several times to dislodge the colonial army, but they were repulsed every time. This commander literally told his troops to say "screw you" to their fear of the British, and it worked. Story 14. The Drevians sent 20 of their best men to try and persuade Olga to marry the living symbol of her husband's murder. Telling them to wait in their boat, she had a ditch dug, and next morning had the emissaries buried alive. Rather than just to leave it at this, a pretty definitive refusal if there ever was one, she sent word back to Prince Mal that she would accept his proposal, but only if the Drevians sent a part of their great and good to accompany her back to their territory. After all, it was important that the proud Kievan Rus see just how important this matchmaking was. Her would-be suitor obliged, sending a party of their chieftains to collect her. Extending a suitably grand welcome, she invited the visitors to wash up in her bathhouse, and then, locking the doors, burned the entire company alive. Olga hatched a plan to do away with the rest of them altogether, and announcing that she would soon arrive at the Drevian capital of Iskorostan, asked for them to arrange a funeral feast where they could mourn over her husband's death in that very city. Despite not having heard from either of the missions they'd dispatched to Olga's court, the Drevians set about preparing the feast, and after drinking themselves insensibly on mead, Olga's soldiers put 5,000 of them to the sword. Now Olga gave to each soldier in her army a pigeon or a sparrow, and ordered them to attach by thread to each pigeon and sparrow a piece of sulfur bound with small pieces of cloth. When night fell, Olga bade her soldiers release the pigeons and the sparrows, so the birds flew to their nests, the pigeons to their cotes, and the sparrows under the eaves. The dovecotes, the coops, the porches, and the hay marrows were set on fire. So, is that a no? Then, I just want to make sure. Story 15. It's Saturday, October 23rd, 2004. 2 gridiron football teams, the Iowa Hawkeyes and the Penn State Nittany Lions, are nearing the end of a brutal game. Whereas the rest of the football world is getting high-flying offenses, this is a defensive war. Iowa is up 6-2, which is already an ugly score. Penn State's defense scored the first points early in the first quarter, a safety, where the ball is downed in/behind the offense's own end zone. Iowa stormed back in the first half with a pair of 27-yard field goals, but the second half of the game has been scoreless. And with 4th and long in their own part of the field, Iowa coach Kirk Ferentz has a decision. The most traditional choice, and the one Ferentz is most known for, is to punt, giving the other team the ball at about midfield. It's all right, but it's not impossible for Penn State to march down, kick a field goal, and set up for a second score. He could also try to make a first down, but given the offense, it's not looking good that he would make it, and that would give Penn State the ball much closer. He takes a third option, the screw you safety. The team lines up to punt, but the punter doesn't kick the ball. He scrambles around the goal line and end zone until chased out by the Penn State defense. Penn State scores 2 more points and gets the ball back, but far on their own side of the field. In doing so, Ferentz basically dares Penn State to score anything. Oh, and this isn't terribly late in the 4th quarter. There's still 8 minutes on the clock, but the Iowa defense gets it done, and the score stands 6-4. Story 16. What England did to Joan of Arc. Henry V had made some major gains in France in the 100 Years' War, and had even reached an agreement with the French king that when he died, Henry would be his heir. Then, Henry died of dysentery. That sucks. As the heir to the English throne is an infant, command of the war goes to the dukes, and long story short, they lay siege to Orleans after a few years. The siege lasts months. Enter Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who can barely write her own name, who convinces the French commander to give her a shot because God is with her. She lifts the siege inside 2 weeks. she spends a while going from victory to victory, robbing the English of all initiative and permanently turning the war in France's favor. So, as you can imagine, England is not happy with her. Losing to this girl repeatedly is just embarrassing. Long story short, she gets captured after a year or so and handed over. The English up to now have been portraying her as a witch, devil worshipper, whatever it took, and now wanted to try her for heresy. They basically wanted to make as much spectacle as possible to embarrass the French. Every church member on the trial was English, despite Joan's protestations and everything. It still wasn't easy. The trials were loaded so heavily to trip her into self-incrimination that it would be horrifying if she hadn't been dodging almost every trap. One of the more memorable exchanges was she asked if she was in the grace of God. A no would be an admission of guilt. A yes would be heretical, as church doctrine was that you can't know if you're in God's grace or not. Her answer was, "If I am, may I be kept there, and if not, may I be guided there." Thus, she dodged the trap. The English archbishop running this kangaroo court was under huge pressure to get her convicted, and eventually it came down to her cross-dressing. She'd been dressing in shirt and trousers in imprisonment to dissuade the guards from assaulting her. A dress can be lifted up, shirt and trousers are more difficult to get around without leaving evidence, but had appeared before the priests in a dress. So they argued cross-dressing was heretical, and she had done it, but then she stopped doing it and then relapsed into heresy, which was punishable by death. So she was burned at the stake, her bones ground down so there would be no relics, and the dust thrown into a river. A few decades later, the Pope ordered a retrial, where she was exonerated of all wrongdoings, and she was later made a saint. But it didn't really do her much good at that point. The English had their revenge on her. But on the bright side, they did lose France, so she was sort of successful in that regard. Story 18. Germany and France have a history of screw you moments. Germany wins the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, managing to take Paris, humiliating the French. The Prussian monarchs see this as a good time to unify Germany into a Prussian-controlled Reich. They do this by signing a treaty in the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles. This unification strengthens the once divided Germany into a formidable European power, as in the days of the Holy Roman Empire. 1919, after the devastation of the Great War on Germany, and after it has dissolved the Reich in Germany to create the Weimar Republic, the Allies, led by a really upset France, had Germany sign the humiliating Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles. The French got back Alsace-Lorraine, which they lost in the Franco-Prussian War, and what should have been a place of German historic pride became one of disaster. But they got their own back. In 1918, the Germans surrendered to the French at the end of the First World War by signing the Armistice of Cowpens. When Hitler invaded France, he found the same carriage and had France surrender to the Nazis in it. It was paraded around the Third Reich, but the Nazis destroyed it when the Soviets took Berlin. I'm not much of a history guy, so I didn't know a whole lot of this. It does make sense that they've been fighting for a while, though. They're just so close and, in some ways, pretty different, so, conducive to fighting. The whole spiteful thing of making you sign a treaty in the place where you had to sign a treaty when you were defeated, you know what? I want to say I have some respect for it, but also, it was the Nazis, so I won't. But, just that act of revenge isolated, it is kind of a good screw you moment. Anyway, that's the last story for today. I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.